Okay, hello, welcome everyone. The digital world that we want. This conference these past 2 days has been all about bridges. We're going to be talking about bridging the digital divide, bridging gaps that still exist in the use and access to technology, what role for governments, what role for companies, et cetera, et cetera. My name is Jason Carrion. I'm an editor at Quartz, which is a global business news site. And I'm joined by an illustrious panel to talk through the digital world that we want, which will also possibly touch a bit on the digital world that we don't want, because I think that's also an interesting question to talk about. Technology doesn't respect borders, and this kind of technological disruption is catching lots of companies off guard, to say nothing of governments. One of the gaps we're going to talk about is the gap between policy and technology. If we were talking in terms of software, perhaps, the iterations of technology now are far ahead, I think, than policy, which could still be in beta, let's say. We'll talk about how to bring more inclusive growth in digitalization, democratizing access, allowing people to harness the power of tech, but also avoid the pitfalls. And that's the kind of bridging role that we will discuss today. To set the scene, Andrew Wyckoff, the Director of Science, Technology, and Innovation at the OECD, is going to run through some of the organization's thoughts on that. And while he's speaking, and to begin with, we have a poll question. If you've been here throughout the day, we have this assembly system. I encourage you to fling questions up to me. I get them on this iPad here that I can put to the panelists during the chat, but also we have a poll question, quite simple one, about digital transformation that I would like you all to answer, and we can see how we feel about that later. So do you feel confident in your government's ability to manage the digital transformation? This is a small, easy, sort of simple question. Are you confident, not confident, or not sure? Don't say not sure, that's boring. So without further ado, let's hear from Andrew to set the scene, and then we'll get into the discussion. Andrew.
Thank you, Jason, and good afternoon. Welcome to the OECD. It's my great pleasure to set the scene for this session. Okay. Since the arrival of the PC in 1982, we've witnessed a number of digital breakthroughs. 1995, we privatized the internet. 2007 was the advent of the smartphone, and each has diffused faster than its predecessor. To a lot of us in the room, this is exhilarating, it's cool, it's a sense of wonder to many of us, but to others, it's fundamentally unsettling, disruptive, and a loss of sense of control. And these two reactions are of the divides for which the forum is dedicated to try to bridge. Now, the catalyst, I think, behind this increasing pace of diffusion is that network of networks we call, without thinking about it really, the internet. And that's why things have diffused so quickly and globally. And the internet itself has grown from just being 4% of the world population in 1997, only 20 years ago, to now nearly half the planet has internet access. I mean, that in itself is rather remarkable, but we still have pockets, such as in Africa and South Asia, that lag behind. But still, I would pause for a second and say this technological wave has already touched many that still have not benefited from earlier technological waves, such as electricity or clean water and sanitation. But even within countries where the internet is pervasive, gaps exist. This chart shows, the blue bar shows gaps existing in terms of age, particularly for those of us 55 to 74. And it's particularly noticeable in the lower income countries of Turkey, Mexico, and Greece. But what's interesting, I think, for this figure is if you look at the little white bar and the diamond, those are two different levels of educational attainment. And with education, you can pretty much negate the problem of age. Those with a higher education have the same type of access. We also see gaps in terms of firms. Now, while most firms have a broadband connection or a website, that first level of interaction is relatively easy. Where we lag still is on more sophisticated applications. Only 20% of firms use cloud computing, engage in e-sales, or supply chain management. And these are necessary for getting the productivity gains that we so badly need and look for across the OECD. Now, to me, this is less about spurring new technological developments. The great thing about the digital technologies is they always seem to deliver more at a lower cost. Moore's law is pervasive not only across semiconductors, but across storage and software access and many other dimensions of the IT world. But thanks to competition, ingenuity, and consumer demand, these, such as the falling price of smartphones shown in this figure, we continue to close those gaps. To me, the bigger problem, and the question you were asked before, is about public policies. And I want to zoom in on one case study here. I want to pick on Mexico, because they provide a very good case study. Where prior to 2012, this country, this member of the OECD, had some of the highest broadband costs and lowest penetrations of any of our member countries. A major factor for this situation was a very poor competitive environment. But in December of 2012, that's what this photo shows, the three dominant political parties of Mexico came together and forged a pact for Mexico, where amongst the various reforms targeted, telecom was at the top of that. They changed the Constitution, they introduced an independent regulator, they passed reform legislation that improved competition in the market, and lo and behold, we've seen a dropping in prices for different baskets of telecom services by a factor of 5, 3, and 2, and with it, an uptick in mobile broadband connectivity, adding 50 million more Mexican subscribers in this very short time period. Now, public policies matter, and so do courageous public policy makers, which is the case here. Many, though, these days blame the technology itself, and this is a backlash that I hope the panel addresses, and we need to be attentive to. But in my mind, technology is largely neutral. Rather, it's how it's used. Many get worried about platform economies, but here's an Irish app called Food Cloud that connects supermarkets with good food that's soon to expire with charities that provide food for the hungry. This would have been impossible to think about just a few years ago, but this platform now allows this to happen with zero transaction costs. But there can be a negative side too, like using algorithms that are designed to circumvent the rule of law. Now, what do we want from our digital transformation? Well, it's not much different than what we want right now. We want to be healthy. We want to be educated. But what these tools allow us to do is we can achieve these goals in mass at an affordable cost, such as using telemedicine, such as this project in Canada, or the University of South Africa opening up distance learning to thousands in Africa. We also want to have a clean environment, and this is now made much easier through real-time monitoring, such as what New York City has done, putting sensors on all its water mains and sanitation systems. And we want to reduce the inequalities that exist by using digital technologies like e-payments that tilt the playing field back into the direction of the poor. We also, as Jason said, there's a few things we don't want. We want to make sure that these tools are not used for Orwellian control, and the entities that are gateways to vast amounts of data, whether they be public or private, need to be held accountable and transparent in their collection and use of data. We don't want the benefits just to go to a few, but we want them to be broad-based. I don't mind if people get fabulously rich as long as the technology diffuses and we all get to benefit from it. Nor do we want a regression in our work and living standards, where digital tools are used to create a new digital version of Oliver Twist. Now, it's up to our public policies to ensure that we get the digital world we want and avoid the one we don't. Now, I'm happy so many of you are here today because, to me, there's a sense of urgency about moving on this now rather than later, because in my mind, we're at another point in the cycles that have dominated this world for over 50 years, another inflection point where you can see from this figure, which is just from Mary Meeker's recent slide deck, that Google machine learning basically is at the same level as human word accuracy. And this is only going to go farther and faster with the Internet of Things, the use of big data, machine learning, and the more general use of artificial intelligence. Governments need to leverage these tools and shape them in ways to ensure that we get the digital world we want. Now, this is much easier said than done. That's why I'm happy we have the panel here today. There are a number of challenges that stand in the way as outlined in this slide, and these badly need to be addressed. But we also need to focus on the opportunities, which I think we don't think about enough. We need to embrace this digital era. We have no choice, and use it to design creative new solutions to old problems. That inherent in this technology is an empowering of the individual in a way that has really never been possible before, and this, with it, comes the promise of true inclusion. Lastly, the fact that I'm standing here today speaking to you at an OECD event is emblematic that we are aware of the challenge. We have the tools and institutions and the ability to shape this technological transformation. This is an opportunity that simply did not exist with the agrarian or industrial revolutions. We must rise to this challenge. Now, I'm sure the panel will. I want to tell you that the OECD is doing its part as well. We have a large project underway called Going Digital. It involves 14 different policy communities of the OECD, 10 different parts of the OECD Secretariat, and has 3 key objectives: to understand and map the impacts, to share experiences, and to bring policy up to speed to maximize the benefits and minimize the problems. And with that, thank you very much. I look forward to your attention and to the discussion of the panel.
Thank you, Randy. Okay, great. That was excellent scene setting. And I will introduce our panelists in turn. I'm going to ask them each basically the same question. Andrew said that public policies matter. And so I'm curious, from all their perspectives, we have ministers, we have former ministers, we have people from service providers working in public policy, we have expert researchers on the digital economy. I want to know what, in your mind, can governments do in this sense? I'm going to start with the minister, Boris Kobrenikar, who's the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Public Administration of Slovenia, who has some very interesting things to say about dealing with the starting over, in a sense, as a member of the former Yugoslavia, but also dealing with some legacy issues and these kinds of things. When it comes to the digital world that we want, what can governments do?
Well, governments have to do a lot, because we are talking about the system change, because the system that we are living in around us changed completely. And as I often say, we have found ourselves in a position that we have, let's say, industry and technology 4.0 and government 1.0. So we really have to adapt to the system that's around us. So basically what we are doing in Slovenia, and I guess also talking to the colleagues, is something that really makes result, is that the main task of the government is that they provide communication, really synchronized, fast, accessible communication in the ground, in the sky, and open data and tools for collaboration. That is the key factor that governments can really do, that they speed up the digitalization. And the digitalization is not a goal, it's just a tool. This is a tool that is becoming smarter and smarter. So if we understand that first we started with E, that means e-services, and everything what was on paper was then electronically. Then M, that means that we are mobile. We can do whatever we want from whatever we want. And now we are coming to the S, smart. So we can use that tools, that data and that communication, an interlinked world, that we decide faster, that we decide smarter, and that we spend less public resources for correcting mistakes and more for predicting what will happen. That's cognitive, and this is what governments have to understand. And from my experience and from talking to the colleagues, I think that we need a lot of, let's say, pressure and understanding that governments will speed up their activities in that field of using digital products that can also produce better governance.
Do you think, you talked about the use of resources there, one follow-up question here, how do you quantify success? Is it just access? Is it some kind of efficiency? How are you thinking about it from your perspective?
Well, if you want to contribute that the country as a whole is more successful, then definitely it's important that you measure how many people are online, how many data do they transfer, and so on. But for me, the key success is how many new services, new products, and new successful companies were successful because of a digital tool. How many business models were changed. Because when it comes to the company point of view, they have to change internally, so digitalize their productivity and improve their productivity, and external, outside. They can use digital tools to get the resources and to sell the results on a global market, because on the digital field, there is no borders practically. The world can be your playground. So more than you have successful players on the world playground, the more successful the digital transformation of the country is, and this is the key measurement.
Got it. Thank you. Malavika Jayaram is the Executive Director of Digital Asia Hub. She is on the faculty of Harvard. And Malavika, what can governments do?
I think one of the really big things government can do is setting baselines and standards. Where private sector might abdicate that space, I think not everyone does, but I think it's a really big normative layer at which governments can intervene, because I see a huge shift from, even in terms of framing, but also in terms of the functional implementation of technology, I see a huge shift from the empowered, engaged citizen to the passive end user. And I think that's, a place where governments are really important. And we used to rely on a very profound philosophical social contract. Now everything is governed by terms and conditions that nobody reads, which are inscrutable, impenetrable, and which, apply by default. So I think behavioral economics shows us that people stick with standard settings. They don't go and exercise control and agency. They don't, even when they have the ability to, which they often don't, they don't necessarily go and change the settings that they have. So I think if government can help in baking in certain minimum baselines and standards about what is a minimum standard for, what you just shouldn't do. And that's why when we were talking over lunch, I mentioned that even the topic of the digital world we want is a very contested idea. It implies that there is one digital world that we all, uniquely and unambiguously want. I think it's a very contested space. There are many ideas of the future. There are many ideas of what equality is. And I think governments play a really big role as an intermediary, and as they have a huge convening power in bringing different stakeholders to the table to hear from everyone, which a private sector entity might go only after a profit motive. I think governments have more of a role to play in bringing the voices that are otherwise disempowered.
Those conceptions of the ideal digital world, are they different by geography? I know, your sort of Asia-focused hub and research you do there. Do you sense that, being here in Western Europe, is the conception of what the ideal digital world is there different than it is here?
I think we borrow a lot, and I think the problem is we borrow the worst of the West without any of the best of its safeguards. I know that's a very controversial thing to say, but I'm a lawyer, I do these things. So I think we often do that, and I think one of the problems you see in a lot of what I think of as low rights jurisdictions is that technology gets beta tested on populations that don't have the ability to protest or to say, I don't want to participate in the social experiment. So it could be something like, cashless, it could be payment systems, it could be biometric identifiers. They're all things that the West touts as being huge, game-changing, technological innovations. But if you ask the actual people who these platforms are being tested on, they're often being done in a vacuum of law and policy. And the reason they're being trialed in certain countries is because there isn't anything stopping it happening. You don't have European data protection law. You don't have the same levels of consumer protection, or product liability. So I think, in a sense, we are the testing ground for a lot of technologies that are then perfected and brought out here. And I think that's something we need to change as well. Yeah. And I think one example in terms of, you talked about geography, but I think it's also about culture. There's, we import a lot of things like this whole Silicon Valley idea of fail faster. That is anathema in Asia. The idea of failure is so traumatic in Asia, where the last thing you will admit to and talk about is that you failed, let alone that you failed faster than everyone else. So one of the things I've been talking about is saying this whole idea of saving face, which is huge in China and a lot of Asian countries. You would never admit to failure, and you would never talk about it publicly. And a lot of Western people come to Asia and say, oh no, you need to change that. You need to get better at talking about failure. And I think, well, actually, maybe you need to be more culturally sensitive in how you expect those conversations to happen. So I think of it like gambling. Chinese and a lot of Asian cultures, Indians, love gambling. But if you think of risk-taking from a gambling perspective, like playing mahjong or doing other kinds of things over Diwali, that has cultural resonance. And it's also this idea of you gamble, you win some, you lose some. That has more cultural resonance than this idea of failure. So I think you can adapt different tropes to what works in country.
Okay. Oh, I see. To your left, Carlos Lopez Blanco is the global head of public and regulatory affairs at Telefónica, and you also have some past government experience too. So from both perspectives there, I'm curious what you think about what governments can do. We were talking earlier about the role of economic leveling, about how digital technologies can help poorer countries catch up faster. I think that may be something you want to...
First of all, thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me and give me and Telefónica the opportunity of sharing with you our views on the digital challenge that we are facing. Let me start with something that has been said in the presentation, and is to transmit you a sense of urgency in everything related with the digital challenge and the digital space. So I think that the first thing that the government should do is to understand the challenge that they are confronting. So I think that one of the things that we need to be aware of is that we are facing probably the most radical change that we have experienced since the Industrial Revolution. And that we need to understand is, and governments need to understand, is that this digital revolution will change everything. And that in this changing everything, they need to understand which should be, in the digital space, the rules of the game. And the second challenge for a government, in my view, is to understand that in the 21st century, rich countries will not be the one with the best natural resources, or not to be with the best physical infrastructures. The rich countries in the 21st century will be the ones able to develop the digital economy and the digitalization. And in that sense, all the governments should understand that there is, for a little of time, an equal opportunity for everyone. So I think that this is important for some governments to understand, that there are some regions in the world, we know very well Latin America, and for Latin America and other regions in the world, now they have a huge opportunity of being one in one generation, one of the leaders of the digital space. And in this context, and to be more specific, that we think is that to understand and to fix the rules of the game is the major liability and responsibility of the governments, and to understand how to adapt the rules of the analog economy to the digital challenges, how to guarantee the access to connectivity that we think that will be essential in that context, and finally, and the most important thing, to promote education. Education will be, and talent will be, the raw material of the digital economy and the digital space, and the most important factor of competitiveness.
Yeah. I want to ask you about where you thought the biggest gaps in access were, and is it education? That's it's a bit squishier, I guess.
It depends on the countries and the situation. Definitively, education is a gap. A big gap. Access is not a big gap in some areas. If you, maybe in Africa, but not definitively in Latin America, the figures that has been shown is that, for instance, Latin America is next to Europe or the US in terms of access. Education is a gap. Age is a big gap. So I think that elderly persons are behind in terms of digitalization. Gender, as I expressed, is a gap, and mainly education and rural areas are probably, that are connected to each other, are probably two of the major gaps that we have to tackle with.
Right. Great, thank you. Nicholas Lundblad on the end is the Vice President of Public Policy and Government Relations at Google for EMEA. Nicholas, what role for governments in addressing the digital gap?
So I agree with much of what has been said already. That's the sort of downside of being at the end of a very sophisticated and good panel, I suppose. But I'd add two things, I think. One is that I think the governments can foster a spirit of exploration and experimentation. When Nobel Prize winner Herbert Simon was asked late on in his career what he regretted the most, he said that it was that I gave a lot of people the advice that they should figure out what they wanted to do with a computer before they got one. I should have been paying back all of the fees I got for consulting that way. And what I should have done instead, he said, was that I should have told them to get a computer and then start experimenting, learning, using it, exploring what it could do in different ways. Naturally in a responsible way, to come back to the comments earlier, but still have that spirit of exploration. And in addition to that, I think there are certain countries that actually play a special role, because it's not the same for all governments. We have some governments that have a fairly high level of access. They have a fairly sophisticated set of people who love technology and have had the opportunity and luck and to get these technologies. Those front-runner countries, I think, have an opportunity and a responsibility to lead, and also to take the flag and try to push forward both the rule sets that Carlos spoke about, but also new uses of technology, figuring out how we can take technology and make sure that we find new uses for it that can help economic growth, that can help education, can help gender equality, and can help reach a more sustainable economy as well.
We were talking earlier. Tell us a bit about this growth engine program. That was something interesting, because I think what's going to come up a lot, and it's relevant that this will seek into the next thing we talk about, is this public-private partnership type model. Tell us a bit about that and what it involved.
But 2 years ago, we sat down in the European management group, and we asked ourselves what we could do that would be most beneficial in the EMEA markets. And we decided that what we would do is that we would bring digital skills to all the people in the EMEA market if we could. Now, we obviously couldn't do it at once, so we set a target to train 1 million people. We reached that far faster than we thought we could, and so we then set out to train 2 million. And the project is really about trying to find the socioeconomic structure in a country, trying to find different groups, and building a basket of different educations. Because I think the educational gap that Carlos spoke about is really there, but it's very different for different groups in society, so we need to be able to tailor it to them. And that's something that we've now been expanding to Africa, where we've trained another 1 million people as well. The idea behind this is that you can have any range of digital skills. You can be simple skills from using a computer, just basic digital literacy, to advanced skills of programming apps for mobile operating systems. But you have to, as a public-private partnership solution, try to extend those.
Yeah. And then there's one last follow-up here. That's quite a controversial question from the audience. What is the timeline towards an AI government?
I don't think you'll ever have that. One of the things that we misunderstand about AI, and that's an interesting question, actually. One of the things we misunderstand is that we think that it's always going to be about substitution. It's going to be about the computer doing something instead of human beings. That is not the case. What AI is a complementarity. So the question I would put back, and I would put that to the governments in the room, is when are you going to use AI more in order to strengthen the intelligence you gather, the kind of decisions you make, the economic outlooks that you create, etc. So that's the real question. Partnering with AI, not having it substitute you.
Minister, how AI enabled is your ministry?
Okay, that we are not too philosophical about the questions. I'll try to explain it. In the case of Slovenia, what we are trying to do, and do we go in the right direction? How we understand. First, reaction of the government must be much faster. It's not time to have the whole procedure, so that's why we have to experiment. That's why we have to try. That's why we don't have to talk about the complete reforms, but changing things day by day. When I was talking about E, M, and S, smart, that means that you use the big data, that you cross-link the old data from different sources and use them to have a smarter decision. What's that? AI, basically. That means that the governmental decisions are smarter. And this is the way how you adopt to the changed reality. And according to Darwin, the species who survives is not the fastest and the biggest, but the species which adopt the fastest, adopts the first. That's the key question. And now we are in the game of governments and environments which will adopt the fastest. And when it comes to the failure culture, that was also the question. One of the biggest problems of the governments is to introduce the failure culture. You have to decide, you have to change the system, even if you are not 100% sure that it will work. So that's why we are introducing the gaming techniques, a lot of cooperation with the businesses. We are sitting together day by day with the companies, asking them. We even use the Google Garage for educating the public services, the public employees, for example. We, for example, certified our governmental private cloud as a service providing cloud, because internally we are acting our support as a service providing to other governmental bodies. These are some of the measures how we really use what technology brings, that you can act faster and support better what's already changed in the environment. And this is the key awareness that we have to bring in the governments. It's not, do we like technology or not? It's there. If it will not be regulated, standardized, somehow used in order, then we will have a confusion and we will have problems. And this is the role of the government, to try to bring some, let's say, more or less controlling development of all that possibilities that are already laying there.
How politically feasible, though, is it to adopt that attitude towards experimentation and potentially failing, all that kind of stuff? That doesn't square that comfortably, I think, with like electoral cycles or the political messaging that you have to put out there to stay in government.
Well, it's something that's discussed a lot in international, in the workshops, in the OECD. The problem is when you come home and you have to proceed this with the old governmental employees which are learned to act on the old way. But yes, it's already obvious that it will have to be done. And one of the historical, as a colleague from Telefonica said, let's say, changes that we are facing and maybe we are not understanding enough is that internet as a distributed media brought a distributed communication and information, which brought distributed economy, which brought distributed payment system, which have to brought the distributed social and taxation system and consumer protection, and sooner or later we will have distributed democracy. And this is the first-class political questions. I don't believe that we are generally aware of what we are running into.
Right. I think, and that hints at the responsibility and role of what we do with all this data that's being generated. We have telecoms company have a lot of it. People like Google have a lot of data. Governments have a lot of data. There's public-private partnerships that are generating all this kind of stuff. I mean, how, this is for the whole panel, I think you all probably have opinions on this. If, you know, there's this notion that data is now the most important and valuable commodity, which is probably true to a certain degree. I mean, who does it belong to? There's a lot of questions coming in to this effect also. I mean, I'm sure it depends will be the answer, but data governance and regulation responsibility, what's the state-of-the-art thinking there?
I don't take too much time,
Okay.
but I will just give you a direct example what we did. We changed the legislation about the data and changed the philosophy. It's not the question which data can be shared. We said which data cannot be shared. That's data that's conflicting personal, business, or, I don't know, security interest. All the other data, it's public good. We opened the portal, we open the governmental data, and we invite the business, the company's data to also be shared and reused for different things. This is our approach, how a government can do something in speeding up the data sharing, reusing, and build a new things based on data which was not available before.
That sounds like Google's dream.
Well, you have to distinguish, I think, between different kinds of data, right? There's personal data and then non-personal data. And I think that it's exactly right that non-personal data shared openly in a framework of standards and regulation is naturally going to drive a lot of economic growth. I think that's fairly easy to see when you start looking at how this behaves in the economy. And then you have personal data. And personal data is surrounded rightly by a number of institutions, rules, regulations, etc., that are meant to protect the user. And when you ask the question of who it belongs to, I think it's fairly clear when you read the General Data Protection Regulation in the European Union, for example, that the answer is increasingly that the user has the right to take his or her data and leave. And so data portability is becoming a very important institution in the digital economy and one that we have to work in order to develop. We have had a project for doing this for the last 5 years or so, where the idea is that you can go to a service called Google Takeout, you can take your data and you can leave. And that's also important for trust. It's one of the fundamental things that we need to build in the digital economy, which is a mediated economy, right? Is trust. So we have to build the institutions for that. That relies on making sure that people can take their data if they don't believe they're getting the service that they deserve, or that they don't feel that that data is taken care of in a way that they believe is secure. They should be able to take that data and leave.
Right, Carlos.
If I may, so I think that we are living in the digital revolution, a second wave, and this second wave is the data economy. I think that data is exactly at the center of the digital revolution. And let me, I think that is very often said that data is the new oil. And data, but I totally disagree with this. Data is much more than new oil. It's something
Gold.
affecting privacy, is something affecting fundamental rights, is something affecting people's life. So we disagree with this notion that data is only oil, is only a good. We think that data is at the center of the economy and of the social digital life of the future. This is why we think that there is a common challenge here for the private sector and for the public sector, which is to create a data ethics. So how to deal with the sophisticated problems around the data. And this is that in Telefónica we have built around the notion of creating digital confidence. Digital confidence, that means how to provide from the regulation, from the private sector, from the government, this digital confidence that means to provide the protection of privacy, the security, the transparency as something that for us is essential to empower our customers and the citizens in terms of the use of their data. Because for us, the answer that who belongs to the data is very clear. For Telefónica, data belongs to Telefónica's customer. And we have the responsibility of dealing with him and how to give them back the control or the data that is much more than pure oil, is the digital life, and the digital life will be in the future the light itself.
Right. Malavika, I know you have thoughts on this.
Couple of things. A couple of years ago, we set out to write a little guidebook on companies that didn't realize they were actually dealing with data, that it wasn't their core business, but how they actually were. Everybody was. And one of the, we got stuck in the first half hour just defining who people were, because I said, why can't we just talk about people? And somebody said, no, we should talk about data subjects. And someone from Oxfam said, I'm not talking about subjects, that's very colonial. So we couldn't even agree on the terminology about, people that it related to. And then it got really technical. People said, maybe it should be people about whom the data is, or it's data owners. And someone said, well, it's not really a data owner because I generate certain data. Some of it I may have done myself. Some of it is aggregated by companies based, they've taken different data points. They've done analysis. Do I own that layer of analysis? I didn't create it. So do I own that? It's about me, but it's a much more complex and nuanced question. But one of the things that a friend of mine said recently at a conference, she said there are only two industries that call people, that refer to users, the drug industry and technologists. And I think that's, it was funny, but it was also very telling, both in terms of, digital addiction and all of those things, but also in this idea of are they users or are they being used, right? Often they're the subject matter of investigations and surveillance. They're not necessarily people using data to empower their own life opportunities. So I think that's one point I wanted to make. The other one is that I think if you start from the frame of who owns data, you've already lost, because it isn't about ownership anymore. I think that world has gone, because it's actually about entitlements and rights. It's kind of like in the old days you wanted to own software. Then you realized you didn't, you just needed a license to it. You needed a bundle of licensed terms, obligations, things you could do and not do. You didn't need to own the software, and then it became cheaper because you didn't need to own it. I think it's the same thing we're seeing with data, that it's not necessarily that I'm the user or that I'm the owner, but it could be that I'm someone who has certain rights in relation to data because it's about me. So I think that relational aspect is something that's really important, and I think ownership almost misses that point, because I think we're post-ownership in many different ways.
Just a short comment on data. The key is trust, because data exists. And then we always check what's in real life and what's in digital life. For example, if we would like that there would be no abuse in real life, no conflicts, we would be locked everyone in our own room. There would be no problems. This is what we often do with the data. So what we need to do is monitor where are the risks. We follow those risks as we do in real life with the policies, secret services, and everything else, and then data can flow, but still it can be more or less safe. But there is not total guarantee that nothing bad will happen, as in real life. This is one important thing, that we really build a mechanisms to protect and follow the data. What's happening with them? We have to monitor it. And the second very important thing is, again, real life, digital life. If I walk down the street and I step in front of the truck and it hits me, it's not a problem of the state that didn't protect me. So if I behave online dangerously because I don't aware, I don't educate, it's not the reason that we don't share the data. We have to educate ourselves and know that also in the digital space we have to behave according to the way that will enable us to be relatively safe. And that's the only way how we can open data and still have it more or less secure.
I think the framing also is really important, because if you use these metaphors about, data is the new currency, the new oil, the new gold, you incentivize people to keep collecting more of it even if they don't need it. And a lot of startups do it because they think when they exit, that makes them more attractive to a prospective buyer. So they collect things that they don't even need. And people also collect things thinking one day I might need it. I don't know. Let me collect everything I can at the single point of contact that I have up front and get someone to sign off on everything. But I think we're seeing a lot of efforts now where people are trying to reframe that and say data can be a liability, data is the new kryptonite, data is toxic, data is an environmental hazard, because the more data you collect, the more you're responsible for and a bigger liability it is for, for hacking, for cyber attacks. So this sort of utopian idea that data is only positive and good is being balanced in a lot of circles by saying you're responsible for what happens to that data, so only collect what you actually need, which is also the framework of all of data protection law about purpose limitation and data minimization, and saying delete it when it's no longer necessary. And I think there are a lot of safeguards in this sort of offline world that apply equally online. And I would just push back on this idea of real. I think online and offline are both real.
True, true. Carlos.
That was going to be my first comment, that real life today is the digital life, and in some years' time, the digital life will be the only real life that we will have. But let me insist on the data issue. So I think that we can discuss technically, because data, of course, is a very technically complex issue. We can discuss about personal data, private data, anonymized data, pseudo-anonymized data, etc., etc. So it can be a very complex discussion. But for us, there is one central problem here, which is to give transparency to our customers and to citizens that who is using their data, how is using their data, and what sort of data they are using. So is that, for us, this is the central discussion that we have to have. Yeah. Transparency for our customers, transparency for the citizens, which is the only way in which they can feel themselves empowered in the use of data that, let me insist, that is much more than oil. It's something that implies personal life, implies rights, the people's rights, implies privacy, etc., etc. And for us, transparency is a must and is essential in the digital space.
Yeah. Nicholas.
Yes. So let me build on that. I think not only transparency, but also control. What you need to be able to do is to give to people who have their data collected the ability to see what data was collected about them and then delete it if they don't agree with having that be collected. So many of the large internet companies, if not most, now have some kind of controls that they offer to users. So for example, we have something called My Account. And you should go into it because it will allow you to set your security settings. It will allow you to figure out what data you want to have be collected about you and what data you want to delete. And what the account does is that it provides a transparency, but then also the ability to delete and change the way the data is collected about you. And I think we're heading towards a number of institutions like that. We're heading towards numbers of control that I think will be really important to work on. The other comment I'd like to make is, I think this notion of what metaphors we use and whether or not they're important is right. I think that's something that we have to be a little bit careful about. Data is the new oil is something I hear more and more often. Yet still, no new dinosaurs are dying and producing new oil. Oil is a scarce resource in a very specific way. So data is slightly different. We know that a doubling rate for data, and it's basically 12 months. The amount of digitally stored data doubles in a year, which is breathtaking if you think about it.
And yet,
so only one small comment on that. I agree that control is essential, but sometimes there are some companies providing control with no transparency. So I think that you give your customers the way of controlling their data, and they are not totally aware of the transparency of how are you using their data, control is useless.
Yeah.
I think transparency also pushes the obligation down to the weakest person in the chain. I think it sort of outsources that responsibility and says, well, I've made everything transparent, now it's you, dumb user, it's your problem to figure it out. And I think that's why the role of baselines and defaults is so important, because the user isn't necessarily going to exercise those options. And I think even if you make data transparent, it's not necessarily scrutable to someone who doesn't have certain digital literacy or skills.
Definitely. There are a fair few questions coming into this, on this point. Nicholas, to put them to you, yes, data is multiplying. It's almost infinite in its possibilities, but there's anxiety, nervousness about data monopolies. You know, that you hear here in France all the time, the GAFA companies, all this kind of stuff, of which Google is a very big one, sitting on a lot of data. Clearly, one of your kind of core competencies and the thing behind the massive valuation. I mean, how do you respond to that worry about, you know, you talk about control and transparency and all that kind of stuff, but the point about terms and conditions are not easy to read. It feels like it's this kind of monolith that's sitting on a monopoly, quote unquote, of data. I mean, how would you respond to some of these?
Well, I think that data is abundant, and I think that there's a lot of data to build businesses on, and we see this happening every day. So I think that is perhaps not the right concern. I think the terms and conditions is an interesting and valid point, actually. We had a project running for a long time to try to figure out how we can get people to read terms and conditions and what we can do. And what we found out is that you cannot only have the terms and conditions be something you're faced with at the very beginning of your using a service, but you have to combine it with, and that's where we develop data portability, the ability to leave later if you don't agree with the terms and conditions, or the ability to change what the terms and conditions actually set out in my account. So you have to build this system overall. And then I understand that there is scrutiny. There should be scrutiny of large companies. There should be scrutiny of successful companies. That's completely fair. But I don't think that we're doing anything that merits any fear if you look closer at it, actually.
I would just add that when we're discussing is it transparency or control, it's always a combination. It's a combination of everything. Transparency, and if you, as a provider, for example, are having these licenses in a small print that no one really reads and understands, well, fine. First step maybe would be that you said legally I'm okay, but you will lose trust, and on long term you will lose business. So it's always the question of, do we trust to our providers? Do we trust that our data is safe? And then we will use this service. Otherwise, we will not use this service.
That's kind of a free market approach to it, though, that the users will decide and lose trust. Is there any role for a stronger hand of the state, for example, if they see that this is just not working, that these terms and conditions are overly lawyered and impossible to understand?
Well, state is responsible to organize the security systems. As we have police and army, we have data security law. We have, for example, in our case, data officer, which is very strict about any kind of a data collection that's anywhere. If there is any demand to clarify where is my data, what's happening with them, we are always dealing with data officer. They are very strict about it, and this is role of the state to have a legal frame. And not only a legal frame, but also the measures to really execute that legal frame when it comes in the concrete cases.
Excellent. I want to shift gears a little bit to get back to some policy questions. And you know, at the outset, we talked about what governments can do. There are different kinds of governments, and I think what's particularly interesting is that we see a lot of, perhaps more innovation at the city and local level in terms of digital transformation, smart cities, all this kind of stuff, smart grids, than at the national level. Is that just the way that things work when you get all the way down to the ground versus at like a federal, national level, or is there something that those bigger national governments can learn from what's happening at local, municipal, city level? Let's start with you, Minister. I think that's good.
Well, when it comes to new environments, new technologies, it's always that, let's say, systematic solutions or standards, as you said, came on the end. So first we have to start to use it, some solutions start to grow, then we are excited about it, then we have bad experiences, then we feel a need to regulate it, and then it comes to the general or national or even international regulation, what's already happening in many areas of digitalization. So it's logical that you have some areas, some experiments that leads to the general solutions which have to be regulated. It's logical development.
Smart cities, anyone else want to weigh in on that?
I think one of my pet peeves in this space is all the focus is on this smart technology and not on people. And I think it's the same with artificial intelligence. We're not doing enough about human intelligence. And you know, even when we talk about it not being a substitute, where we say it will augment and supplement, we talk at a very abstract level about upskilling people who might lose jobs without really thinking about what those jobs might be or what kind of skills you might need for the future. So I think that's a really huge space. So I was really happy to hear that Google is also trying to do stuff in this space. But I think with this sort of, there's a lot of fetishism around smart cities like India and China will, with that kind of scale where they'll say, oh, we'll have 100 smart cities by, you know, in 10 years or whatever. But you can also see why it's a resource management issue where you're not able to provide services to remote areas as well, and you want the city to be the organizing principle. You want urban life to congregate around it, but it's sort of like we were discussing over lunch as well. We're essentially social, and ideas and people and cultures coalesce around, you know, urban conglomerations like cities. So it's sort of natural that that kind of experimentation happens at that level. But I see a lot of really interesting work being done even like lower down at the village level, at sort of far-flung little tiny communities who organize for themselves and don't leave a national federal government who's so far removed from it to actually decide what their local needs are. And I think Rufus Pollock said about open data a long time ago that the best thing that will be done to your data will be by somebody else, right? You put the data out there and all kinds of cool things will happen. And I think it's the same with a lot of technology that happens at the local and city level. You create something, you know, to report on traffic problems or to do something else, and people end up using it to, you know, game it and hack it and do something completely different. And one great example in India was where in a lot of mountainous regions, you can't get fiber easily. You know, you can't lay internet connections. And someone said, well, what are we doing with, you know, certain spectrum of radio waves? Couldn't we be using that to actually communicate with people instead of relying on the internet? And then they found that they turned this sort of one-way broadcast channel into a two-way thing by having dumb phones, where people could actually just use IVR technology on really stupid, cheap phones. And people could vote on issues that were very local to them. You know, like what day do you want the trash collected? Or are you happy with the water supply? Or do you like your mayor? Or, you know, very, very local issues. And then my friend who ran this program said that one day he got a phone call on the radio channel and someone said, am I on the air? Are you recording this? And he said, well, yes. And he goes, great. And he started to sing a song. And the guy said, what are you doing? And he said, my children are going to move to cities. They're not going to tell the old fairy tales. They're not going to sit around the fireplace listening to their grandmothers. They're going to lose cultural history. And he said, I'm just putting, you have a radio station, you have servers and things which I don't have. Record this for future generations. And the radio channel guy said, I thought I was helping with issues of like public, you know, access and, you know, local municipal things. I didn't think I was becoming an archive for cultural memory, but apparently that's what I am today. So I think once you throw it out there, people will do really interesting things at the local level.
Yes, I think that's right. And I think it goes to the point that cities can really be laboratories of digital democracy in different ways, and they can find enormously interesting new services. And that is not to say that they can do it alone. They still need the framework, the playing field that Carlos talked about. They need the rules and the regulations. So it all exists in a context. But I think we can expect a lot from cities when it comes to experimentation and exploration.
So I agree, and I think that there is. I think that cities and regions are the perfect environment for innovation. It's not by chance that the leading innovators in the world are the regions or small countries like Israel or Singapore or cities like London. So I think that the environment, the city or region environment is perfect for innovation. But there are other roles that cannot be played by cities, and mainly two. One, as has been mentioned, regulation. So I think that regulation is a responsibility of the states and the central governments. Spectrum, you have mentioned, is a very obvious example of something that has to be done by a central regulator. But there is a second role that necessarily has to be played by central governments and states, which is to guarantee and to promote the social cohesion. So I think that in the digital space, to keep that, to have the responsibility of not leaving nobody behind, of the incorporation to the access to technology and the digital economy and all the possibilities of the digitalization is our responsibility of the states and the central governments, and is not a role that can be played by dynamic cities or small regions.
Just a comment on smart cities and smart villages and smart environments. And it's not who runs the lighting the best or traffics or water supplies. That are solutions. But to be smart, that means that all the subsystems can communicate between themselves, exchange data, and be more cognitive. And then you have a smart environment that really supports your life or your work what you are doing. And it's always growing. From one experiment that has a good experience, as you add additional solutions, they communicate, they produce more added value. And we are running the initiative, we call it Slovenia Green Reference Country in Digital Europe, what basically means green, that we are using technologies which are kind to the environment and kind to the people. And reference means searching not new innovations, but searching the way how what's already invented really use on system level. And when you go on system level, then you hit to the regulation, standardization, education, mindset changes. And if you break these barriers one by one, slowly, then you have a reference solution. Otherwise, you have a technical idea.
Yeah. We have time for some questions from the floor. If any of you have any, please raise your hand. And in the meantime, I'm going to store those up, and I'm going to ask. I'm curious. You talked about references and these kinds of things. Are there other countries, cities, whatever, elsewhere? We heard the example of Mexico earlier. There's been a bunch of other countries mentioned on this panel. Is there examples that you admire that you think could apply to Slovenia in terms of addressing some part of this idea of the digital gap or these kinds of things? Who do you look for inspiration, let's say? I'm curious.
Well, it's hard to say that there is one example that we follow, but there is thousands of examples. We all try to find our own way. So what's to learn about it? Is again, communicate, exchange, and from different experiments build a better one, and again exchange and build a better one. That's called progress. And this is the only way. It's not one solution which is the best. But on the end, we will have to negotiate also for some common standards, because we will have to communicate with each other. Whatever is digital, it's not closed in the country borders. It's global. So if you want to bring value that we can bring with the digital solutions to the people, to the businesses, we will have to agree how we will communicate globally, exchange data, and even regulate the key problems globally. That's the question of cooperation.
Any other examples on the panel that you want to share with the audience of a very worldly globe-trotting panel? I'm sure you've seen something out there that's interesting. Is there anything in Latin America that we should know about that we might not be aware of? We talked about economic leveling earlier.
Let me first give you two examples out of Latin America. One is the Baltic countries in Europe. I think that they have been clever enough in period of time to understand that to be behind in terms of development of certain infrastructure of services could be an advantage, and they have jumped. And we think that this is a very good example that I wanted to say when I said that for Latin America this is a huge opportunity, because the digital economy permits the regions and the countries to jump and trying to overcome all the deficits that they have been in the traditional space. And let me give you a second example of quick development in terms of access, which is two countries in Europe, Spain and Portugal. Spain and Portugal, in the middle of the crisis, have come from be on the bottom of the list of the European infrastructure in terms of fiber deployment to the top. And now Spain is the fourth largest country in the world in terms of fiber deployment. For me, the lesson is not therefore made by Portugal or Spain. The lesson is that you can't do this in the middle of a very serious economic crisis. Economic crises sometimes are big opportunities. And let me combine these two lessons for Latin America. So I think that Latin America is going through a difficult period in terms of economic crisis. And for us, this is a huge opportunity to jump and to be in the future well positioned in terms of the deployment of the digital economy in that region.
Great. Nicholas.
Yes. So I think, I mean, looking at the many different countries that are working on this, the ones I find to be quite advanced are the Scandinavian countries and the Benelux countries. We see in those countries both the spirit of experimentation, the use of technology in the public sector, and the interest in finding private-public partnerships and different ways to advance technology. I think is quite right. Carlos also mentions the Baltic countries, and I think that's exactly spot on. But I think you can find, and I think this is the good example that we heard from the Deputy Prime Minister earlier, we can find thousands of good examples from within countries. So just pointing to countries alone might not be the first thing we want to do. But since your question was about countries, I would identify those as the front runners.
Great. Well, we have a question here in the front, and then I'll get to you there. Just tell us who you are, and then briefly, please.
Yeah. This is Professor Aman Agarwal from Indian Institute of Finance based out of Delhi. And my question is that, in the digital age we are living, there is the World Development Report which came out on the digital dividends, which talked about the way benefits were coming on to the population, the way digital was seeping into daily life from a common man across board, whether it is Africa or the US or any other part of the world. So we see in the debate both pros and cons which have been debated, both of data and the digital world. Do you think, given the way digital world is seeping into lives of governments, peoples, bringing transparency and things like this, this big gender gap pay debates which have been going on at the IMF World Bank meeting in about a month back and other forums as well, do we see that also disappearing, given that we are moving into the digital space which does not recognize gender in any form and is quite impartial to who does work there and who doesn't? And do we see that kind of a benefit coming to the masses? And we have seen that happen, at least in terms of financial inclusion, going very fast after the demonetization in India, where it did bring in certain big fruits. It certainly takes at least 3 quarters before we see good results or something happening. But we did see an extensive expansion of the digital space moving in India after the demonetization on the 8th of November. So do we see the similar kind of an impact where innovations are creating disruptions in terms of gender gap issues as well?
Yeah. Gender. Anyone want to take that one? Is technology gender blind?
I think one of the sort of things we see a lot is, telling women that they need to learn how to code. And I think that's a very tiny piece of the problem, because the bigger problem is what world are you bringing them into once they learn how to code. If the ecosystem and the environment is still intensely male-dominated or, biased in many other ways, just telling them to learn to code means they learn to code, come join your company and leave in 2 years to, do something else. So I think the structural issues need to be addressed. It's not just about computer software and literacy. But in terms of the gaps, I think we've seen in India in a lot of instances how when you allow women to bank and you include them in the financial system, you have a lot more sound management of money. But you also see that when services are increasingly digitized, the women are thrown out of the system because they don't have as much access to technology as the men do. So I think it can work both ways. So you need to be really nuanced in how you deal with that. But I think also, I don't think the online space is gender blind at all. In fact, as we've seen with trolls and hate speech and a lot of abuse online, it's actually a terrible world to bring women onto. So to the point where we're actually using censorship as a mechanism to make it more gender neutral. And that's a terrible place to end up, where you think you need to limit speech in order to affect some other imbalance. So it's a very, very difficult problem.
Just a general comment on, okay, gender gap and then the economy gap, but it's still the communication or the access is becoming very cheap. The knowledge, it's online. You have a global knowledge online. That's unique. You have a global market online. That's unique. So this is really opportunity that we have to grab. And when it comes to the gender differences, of course, there is the contents of on the internet, and so that have to be, I don't know, to fight against it. But one question is who and how is using the products, and the other question is that really those technologies are becoming technologically more complicated, but to run them, we will need a different knowledge and different understandings, where maybe man's technical knowledge will not be so superior as it was, because we will have to have cognitive systems, more understanding of the user, and this is opportunity also for the women to have more important role in creating new systems.
Nicholas.
So there's no technical fix for gender equality, absolutely not. But I think that the promise of having a more inclusive environment is there. Early research indicates that women are actually more comfortable participating in, for example, online commerce or online platforms or online innovation marketplaces, etc., because they can do so in a slightly different way than they can otherwise. And actually their ideas are heard in a more equal way. So there are promising components in the digital environment, but I would caution against saying that there is a technical fix to gender equality. That's a larger institutional challenge that we have to meet as a society.
Sure. Carlos.
Yes. Finally, I agree with everything that has been said. Let me, in the issue of digital divide, first to say that the most important thing for digital divide is to guarantee the access. If there is no access in remote areas, the digital divide will be impossible to solve. But once you have the access in rural areas and remote areas, let me compare two gaps. One is the age gap, and the other is the gender gap. So I think that the age gap is a real digital gap. So it's independent of relatively independent of the level of education, cities or rural areas, etc., etc. But the gender gap is not a digital gap. So I think there is only one aspect of a general problem, which is related mainly to education and to development of women in rural areas. But there is no, as in the elderly gap, there is no specific digital gap for women and for gender.
I think one of the best comments about the age issue was from Windsurf, when people were saying, old people don't understand technology, and he's like, I have news for you. We invented the internet.
We had a question here in the front.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Guinan from Bilkent University and University of Paris. I think information distortion and data distortion is a non-negligible reality of our times. And I would like to ask the panel members how they can endogenize, the solution of this problem to their analysis.
What do you mean by distortion?
Distortion means that in reality, you are manipulating the data.
Okay.
You are manipulating the information, and it's a huge problem which exists. I've been lecturing that for the last 10 years. So.
Yeah, newly topical.
I can refer to that because we were dealing with this in the workshop before, let's say, or with the fake news and let's say, or news presented in design time and so on. So if the internet and social media can be one of the most democratic opportunities, because everyone can have an opinion. On the other hand, if there is abuse about this, can be also very powerful tool for manipulation. So again, it comes to the set of measures that we have to build trust, we have to educate ourselves, what are the trusted sources, and somehow I believe that also what's happening online will have to be regulated, will have to be monitored if we all agree that's good for all of us. And if it's completely unregulated, then we will have problems.
I think one of the problems is that a lot of disseminators or aggregators of news and people who are intermediaries are not treated as media. So you have a lot of companies people don't read newspapers directly. People don't even know how to use browsers and search for things anymore. They don't go to the source. They read it on Facebook, for example, right? It's all aggregated. They don't know where it came from. So I think, but they don't conform to the same journalistic standards or ethics, so they're not treated as the press and media in the same way that the so-called failing mainstream media is. So I think that's a huge problem, and that's something that people are cognizant of now and are trying to fix. And I think that's also an area where technology can play a huge role. I think something like artificial intelligence is being trialed as a way to actually deal with source and provenance of news, where it comes from, is it a chatbot, is it a real human? I think there are ways that technology is being used to fix this problem, or at least indicate, pressure points and problems.
Yeah. Did you want to?
So I think that this is one aspect of I mentioned at the beginning that for me the challenge is how to fix the rules of the game in the digital world. And I think that this is a good example that we are in the middle of a huge transformation. So we still live in the analog world, in that you call the real world, but in 5-10 years' time, the only world will be that we call today the digital world. That means that we need to rethink everything in terms of how the rules of the game are going to survive in the digital world. In other terms, for instance, we think that we need to have a political debate on how it's going to be the rule of law in the digital space. It's something that we have solved in the 19th century in Europe, but we have to rethink what the rule of law, what democracy, what citizenship mean in the digital world, because everything is changing and everything is going to be affected. And one of the things that we need to understand is what public opinion means in the digital space, because up to now we knew very well what public opinion means in the traditional world, but what public opinion means, what is really the public opinion in our world of social media, traditional media, etc., etc. So that I think is that we are confronting radical questions and radical issues, and we have to have that is, in our view, a political debate of the rules of the game for the digital space.
Thank you. So just a quick thing. Sorry, the issue of information quality is a fundamental one for the web, and it is fundamental for two reasons. One is that we rely on it to make a lot of our decisions. The other is that the web is an adversarial environment. So typically when you try to get people's attention, you will do it in any number of different ways. So that kind of environment requires that you constantly evolve. It's sort of a Red Queen problem. It takes all of the running you can do to remain in exactly the same place. For search and for other information discoveries, this has been the case for a long time. And the answer that we have found looking at information distortion and data distortion is that you have to build a new ecosystem and a new institutional system around the delivery of information and data. We have, for example, included fact checkers in Google News, and we outsource a fact check standard in order to use a specific standard to different organizations that can help to accomplish this information quality improvement that we need. Now, this is not a new thing. When news started in the US, they were referred to as the infamous scribblers by the then president, and then slowly built institutions, built quality into what they did, and ended up being a very qualitative information space. I think we will see the same. I think we should be optimistic about this. I think we will see the same with this online space. It doesn't necessarily take treating all of the providers according to an old schema to apply the media schema to the new providers, but it takes understanding what our public sphere looks like now. It has information discovery as a fundamental mechanism because of the wealth of information out there. That is probably different from information publishing, and we should figure out how to deal with that.
Yeah. We have a question over here in the back. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Victoria Collins from a youth think tank called Econ Plus. It's quite a large question about digitalization and the world we want, but I wanted to touch on a topic that was mentioned on AI and government. And I wonder if we think that governments, I don't think they are, but are using the data and the big data and the AI out there enough. What opportunities are out there? Because, for example, I have no idea if this is a good idea, but I think of all the data that LinkedIn is collecting on skills at the moment, and the fact that on the other hand we have discussion on skills crisis, what's the future, and I wonder what the dialogue is between this big company which sells all that data and government. Just one tiny example of the kind of discussions we could have. So my key questions are there any good examples out there of how governments are using the data, the companies that are existing, and what opportunities or not do you think there are for that in the future?
Excellent question. I think we'll start with you.
Sorry, I'll try to ask also from our, let's say, some examples. You mentioned LinkedIn. When we went to LinkedIn with the delegation, first we checked what's their data on our Slovenian environment, and we use it when we decide to plan it. When we were working with, for example, EMC company, we use the governmental data and their tools to have a big data analysis on what kind of information are we sitting on, but we don't know how to discover it. That's another example. When we were talking to Uber, for example, to drive in Slovenia, we said, okay, we would like to have your geolocations without names and drivers and everything, only geolocation that we can follow the traffic. That's another example of cooperation. And I don't know, I could go on. So this is how we try to work to connect with industry and government. And when you cross-linked two data sources, you will not get 2 plus 2 is 4. You will get 16. Because you get much more interesting information. And why we are so keen to do this? It's prevention. If you can predict what will happen, you can prevent it. If you prevent it, you don't spend the resources to correct it, and you can spend the resources to invest. If you, for example, are following your blood pressure and blood picture, you know what kind of a disease it's starting, or you will get stroke, and you can prevent it, and money that you would spend for the health, for curing, you are investing in better prevention. And it comes the same with the energy, with the traffic, with the governmental finances. It's always the same principle. If you use a lot of big data, smart use, that's artificial intelligence as I understand it, then you predict and you do better decisions and you spend your resources wisely.
Nicholas.
Sorry, can I interrupt you? I have another question. It's from the side here, if I may. Sorry, I'm waiting
and then we'll get to Nicholas. Yeah.
moment. The question would be, if you predict or if you're going to anticipate what's going to happen, where do you see big data or digitalization from now on in the next 50 years? And what are the challenges and what are the barriers? Or what kind of supranational organization will try to manage all the data?
Right.
Or control or have kind of supervisionary
Yeah,
function?
got it. Nicholas.
So I think the most interesting promise of technology is that it will help us learn faster. This is something that I think we can do with technology, with big data, with artificial intelligence. It will complement our ability to learn. And the question we got earlier about whether or not governments are doing enough is if you translate it into that paradigm, you realize what you're asking is, are we learning enough? And of course we're not. We can learn a lot more about an increasingly complex environment by using data and using artificial intelligence in different ways. And it's not going to be one single organization that does this to address that question. It's going to be a lot of different organizations together under an international framework of rules that then devolves into a regional framework of rules, and in partnership often, I think, with the private and the public sector. And so to me, I think the thing we have to focus on when we look at this, and the promise that we have to explore much more, is how we can learn from all of the data we already have, because we have a wealth of insights that we're currently not using. And I think the responsible governance is probably learning as fast and as much as we can in a quickly changing environment.
Yeah. Could we get the result of the poll up on the screen, please? I'm sorry to say, in terms of responsible governance, I'm sorry to, I'm kind of previewing what came out here, but it's going to come up here in a sec. But yeah, so the results were that 60%-ish of the audience doesn't feel confident in the government's ability to manage this digital transformation. I think to close out, because we are out of time, I just wanted a brief comment from each of the panelists here about whether they share that sentiment, or if they don't, how would they respond to the naysayers out there? I'll start with you, Minister.
Well, I can comment the result and also answer the last question. Who will run the data? Who will be the trusted authority to have access to only this big data? It has to be public. If it's public, it's publicly controlled, it's publicly used. It's actually what the colleague from the Google said. If it's public, then it's not the question who is controlling this asset, because it's generally shared. And if we build this approach, open data, transparency, really publish what can be published, then this result of the voting can be in the future different. Because this result is logical result of let's say, governments who have no concrete idea how to deal with the digital transformation that's already happening around them. I just threw out few examples that may work, and at least in our case, they are working.
Thank you. Malvika.
I think there has to be a better feedback loop between government and the private sector, because I think the solution is not collecting more data. It's about having a better signal-to-noise ratio with the data you collect. It's having better quality data and not getting lost in the noise. And I think that's something we need to get really better at. And I think this theme of sort of complementarity and augmentation is something I think equally applies to this space, where there are some things government is best equipped to do at scale with human rights standards baked in, make certain things mandatory or legal. And there are some things the private sector is much better at. They're nimble, they're able to innovate, they can adapt. They don't need to solve a problem to suit everyone the way a government does. So I think there are ways that government can learn how the private sector does some things really well, and the private sector needs to bake in certain ethical standards. So I think in response to the lady's question at the back, she used the LinkedIn example, but I think the reason governments increasingly look to the private sector for data and solutions is because old-fashioned government tools like the census are increasingly being dismantled because they take too long to do, they're not as efficient, companies are doing it, they're too expensive. But I think there isn't a substitute for that kind of a neutral, objective collection of data as opposed to, more insular, siloed looks at data. So I think the role of alternatives and cooperation between private and public is what I would urge.
I'm trying to suss how you would answer the question, confident, not confident, don't know.
I was trying to say how you could get more confident.
Yeah,
but,
okay. You're on the way to be confident then.
I think it depends on your threat model as well.
Okay. Got it.
Yeah, it depends on what kind of government, if it's democratic or not.
Fair enough. Carlos.
So I think that there is two different issues. One is the ability of the public sector managing the data, but there is a second one that in my view is much more important, which is the reliability of the public sector managing data. So I think that this is the real question. Are the public sector reliable in the use they make of the data? The public sector and the private sector. And for me, there is the answer is very simple, and this has been always the answer. The answer is accountability. The answer is control. The answer is transparency. But this is something that was invented in the French Revolution, so I think that is not something new. The challenge is how to adapt these principles that we know very well to the new problems and the digital space and the digital economy. But the solutions are very, very well proven and are based on transparency, control, accountability, etc. Rule of law at the end of the day.
Nicholas, the final word.
I think that the digital transformation is not necessarily something for a government to manage. I think that's something it's shaped by government, private sectors, citizens, and all of the other interests of society together. So given that view, I think that the result's quite understandable. It's not something that you can easily manage. It's something you have to shape with democratic institutions, with influence, and with collaboration in an inclusive manner in order to get to that point where we can realize the promise of what this digital technology can actually do. Now, I'll stop by saying that I'm an extreme optimist. I think that this will actually develop in a very fruitful way, and an extreme optimist is defined by John McCarthy, one of the fathers of artificial intelligence, as someone who thinks that things will turn out okay even if people don't do what he tells them to.
Fair enough. I think that's a great note to end on. Cautiously optimistic, but realistic about the digital world that we want. If we could just thank our panelists for sharing their thoughts, and thank you very much for coming.